So this is a reading of an account titled Firefight above Gowardesh by Lieutenant Colonel John C. Mountcastle, detailing an intense firefight that took place between U.S. soldiers from 371 Cav, U.S. Army's 10th Mountain Division, and Taliban fighters on 21 June 2006. The fight. Monty and Cunningham now faced a tough tactical decision of whether to move or stay in position. The dilemma was strikingly similar to that of the SEAL team during Operation Red Wings. They believed their position had been compromised, but it was uncertain what that would mean for their mission. For the SEAL team, discovery by the local Afghan had led to an attack by a large enemy force. Conventional tactical wisdom might have suggested finding a new location for the patrol base, but there was nothing conventional about conducting operations on a narrow ridge line in the mountains of Afghanistan. Back at Fob Nare, the Task Force Titan battle staff was not overly concerned with the situation. After all, the intelligence assessments had predicted that the enemy would indeed attempt to watch the kill team, while suggesting that a direct attack was less likely. Thus, the team situation had been anticipated to a degree. The Task Force S2 recalled no discussion within the staff on moving the team to a new location at that point. During the intense planning and coordination for the upcoming operation, the team's report of the Afghan with the binoculars was not interpreted as an emergency at Fob Nare. Up on the mountain, the kill team leaders discussed their tactical options. Staff Sergeant Cunningham later described the conversation between himself and another team NCO, Sergeant John Hawes, regarding their situation. We can't go up the ridgeline any further. If we go any further, we're possibly going to get ambushed on the way up there. So we're either going to hold this position or move back down. If we move back down, we're going to give them the high ground. So we decided to hold the high ground, pull security on what we're supposed to be watching. End quote. In addition to the possibility of being attacked, there was no assurance that the team would find a vantage point further north up the ridge or further down that would allow them to accomplish their mission. Given this uncertainty, Staff Sergeant Cunningham and Staff Sergeant Monty decided that the team would stay in position. Unaware of the large group of insurgents that was moving toward them from the north as the late afternoon turned into evening, Monty and Cunningham informed the rest of the team that they would remain where they were and directed them to continue their observation of the NAIs in the valley. The soldiers cross-leveled supplies, began guard shifts, and took time to eat and drink. The decision to remain at the patrol base was the third of 3 fateful decisions leading up to the deadly engagement. 6 of the kill team members were positioned at the northern side of the patrol base, facing a line of thick vegetation. Here's a key gaming point about terrain. 3 soldiers continued to monitor the valley on the eastern side of the position. To the south, the team leaders formed what they called an alamo, or a place you can fight back to, near a group of large rocks and trees. There, Cunningham, Monty, and Hawes continued to discuss the security plan for the night and the next day. Although the members of the kill team were alert and vigilant, they had no indicators of enemy activity in the vicinity of their position. At 1845, almost 5 hours after the resupply UH-60 departed the ridgeline, Specialist Franklin Woods suddenly heard the sounds of people approaching through the wooded area to the north of the patrol base, and seconds later, a heavy barrage of rocket-propelled grenade, or RPG, rounds and machine gun and small arms fire burst from the wooded area. Round after round slammed into the ground and rocks around the patrol base, sending the soldiers scrambling for cover. And right here we have the effects of suppression. It was clear from the sheer amount of fire striking the position that the attackers were numerous and very well equipped. Staff Sergeant Cunningham later recalled the intensity of the initial barrage by stating, "I've been in a bunch of firefights. That was probably one of the most intense." Here we have fire superiority, and we also have fire intensity. Specialist Daniel Linehan remembered being amazed by the ridiculous volume of RPG fire. So here we have basically volume RPG fire used as basically suppressive fire. Now well aware that the enemy group maneuvering against him was not just a few insurgents with AK-47s, but something much larger, Linehan recalled, "They clearly came up there to kill every one of us. After several minutes of intense fire coming from the woods to the north, it became clear to the soldiers on that end of the perimeter that approximately 50 insurgents were coming toward them and attempting to flank the patrol base. So here we have maneuver and numbers involved. The enemy had established 2 support by fire positions to the north and northwest and continued to pour machine gun fire into the patrol base. After the initial shock of the sudden attack wore off, the soldiers of the kill team began to fight back. Those positioned closest to the enemy advanced on the northern edge of the perimeter, returned fire into the tree line, but realizing that they were too exposed, began to fall back to the Alamo and the cover of the rocks. Specialist Sean Highstand fired a burst from his assault rifle in the direction of the enemy and then got up and darted for the southeast corner of the team's position. Private First Class Brian Bradbury, a squad automatic weapon or saw gunner, followed right on Highstand's heels but was struck by enemy fire almost immediately and went down in the clearing badly wounded. The 3 other team members on the northern end of the perimeter sought to put some distance between themselves and the enemy. In unison, they rushed to the southeast, diving behind the cover of the rocks as small arms fire and RPG rounds whizzed by. In the dash, Private First Class Mark James was wounded but was able to make it to the rocks, where Specialist Matthew Chambers grabbed him and began to treat his wounds. The fight was just 2 minutes old and the Americans already had 2 soldiers wounded, one of them critically and out in the open. So right there we have a time metric. Again, a time metric to casualties sustained for a certain high level of fire intensity. While soldiers were repositioning themselves at Alamo, at the southern end of the perimeter, Sergeant Patrick Liebert laid down a continuous cover fire with his assault rifle. The enemy fighters could be heard shouting to one another in the woods ahead as they tried to maneuver closer to the Americans. Liebert continued to fire steady bursts at the sounds of the enemy, trying to buy time for the other members of the kill team as they formed a new perimeter behind the rocks. And by the way, here we have an example of unobserved fire. Minutes later, Sergeant Liebert was struck by enemy fire which mortally wounded him. Other members of the team saw Liebert's head slump forward, and when they called to him, he did not answer or move. The kill team had suffered its first fatality. Initial attempts to get Liebert were repulsed by the steady stream of incoming fire. Specialist Linehan, who was positioned closest to Liebert, could not get to him, but during one of his several attempts, he was able to secure Liebert's weapon and hand it to one of the other soldiers behind the rock barrier. As the kill team quickly reformed a tight perimeter to the south of the rocks, Staff Sergeant Cunningham directed the team's fire against the enemy, while Staff Sergeant Monty initiated a call for fire over the Task Force Fire Support Radio Network. So already at this point in the firefight, we have our first attempt to call for fire. In his situation report, he expressed the severity of the team's situation and the possibility that it might be overrun. The fire support coordinator on the other end of the radio remembered Monty's very calm, very clear voice on the radio, despite what was an increasingly grave situation. In his normal measured tone, Monty provided the grid coordinates for mortars and artillery support, specifying the need for danger close fires or rounds that would land approximately 200 to 300 meters from the team. One thing that many soldiers operating in northeastern Afghanistan would learn is that the steep inclines in the mountainous terrain greatly influence the effectiveness of indirect fire. Where one might be afforded a little leeway in coordinating fires for a relatively flat target area, there was no such leeway in the mountains. Calculation errors of only a few meters could render an artillery or airstrike completely ineffective. Within seconds, task force mortar fire began slamming the woods to the north, but further off than the team needed. So here we have an indication of both time of response for task force mortars. So these would be organic mortars. And we also have an indication of accuracy and the effects of accuracy. Unknown to the soldiers of the kill team, the crews manning the 120mm mortar position at Gowardesh Bridge came under attack at almost the same time as the soldiers on the ridgeline, albeit from a smaller enemy force. While fighting off the attack on their own position, the mortar platoon at the bridge continued to answer Monty's call for fire. As the mortar rounds landed in the trees, enemy RPG and RPK fire decreased. That fire, however, was still intense enough to keep the soldiers pinned to the ground and unable to maneuver or get to Sergeant Liebert or Private First Class Bradbury. At the Task Force Titan Tactical Operations Center, or TOC, at Fab-Neuray, the squadron staff was reacting reacting to the initial reports of contact with the enemy. Two units were simultaneously defending themselves from unexpected insurgent attacks. This was the first indication that the enemy operating in Nuristan was much more sophisticated, organized, and aggressive than previously thought. For Staff Sergeant Cunningham, the coordinated attacks proved that the enemy consisted of pretty smart guys. As the radio reports of the engagement continued, not much could be gathered about the composition or the exact disposition of the enemy. Staff Sergeant Monty was pinned down by the enemy's RPGs, unable to provide the details the squadron staff wanted. It was clear to those in Tactical Operations Center, the TOC, that the kill team was up against a sizable enemy force. The Squadron S2 recalled, "We were surprised by the number of enemy fighters reportedly involved, since it constituted the most dangerous course of action. The first reaction of many in the TOC was to assume that the helicopter resupply had indeed alerted the enemy to the kill team's presence, allowing them to organize an attack. Given that the attack occurred approximately 5 hours after the resupply drop, it is also possible that the enemy force was already positioned on the mountain and aware of the Americans' location when the UH-60 hovered over them. The coordinated attack against the mortars also supported the notion that what the kill team was facing was much more of a planned, organized attack than a rapid reaction to the helicopter sighting." As the Squadron S3, Major Timmons commented, "You don't consolidate that number of people with that much armament that fast without significant preparation." In all likelihood, the enemy force of 50 to 70 fighters was already moving toward the kill team, planning an attack. The resupply mission of that afternoon might have served the insurgents as confirmation of the kill team's location. If true, the enemy had likely observed the kill team as they entered the valley near the Gowardesh Bridge and began their infiltration. Thinking back on the event, Captain Burkhoff made an apt observation. "Since we underestimated the enemy's organizational capabilities, we should certainly not underestimate their degree of situational awareness on their own mountaintops." Whether the attack on the kill team was triggered by observation of the team near the bridge or by the aerial resupply remains unclear. What is evident, however, is that the enemy in Nuristan in 2006 was capable of maneuvering a large, well-equipped force to within 100 meters of the enemy's position undetected. Here again we have a range metric to consider, and launching a coordinated attack that took both the team and the task force by complete surprise. While continuing its supporting RPG and machine gun fire, and perhaps spurred on by the incoming mortars, the enemy began to attempt to flank the kill squad's position from both the northeast and western sides. To the northeast, Private Sean Smith had been able to secure a sniper rifle while falling back to a position behind the rocks, and now used it with great effect. In a spot hidden from enemy view, he engaged a number of insurgents trying to use the footpath to skirt the eastern side of the team's position, killing a number of them. Here we have an example of point fire against area targets. Killing a number of them, remembering Smith's effective defense of their eastern flank, Staff Sergeant Cunningham recalled, "Every guy that would come across that trail would get dropped." Meanwhile, Monty maintained communications with the mortar platoon in an attempt to adjust the fires closer to his position. He paused long enough to engage an advancing group of insurgents just 20 meters away with his M4 carbine and a grenade, forcing them back. So here we have evidence of something very close to close combat in game terms, and as well use of grenade in close combat. The kill team fought in 3 directions, directing fire to the north, west, and east. For the moment, the enemy's flanking attempts had been checked, but the steady insurgent fire from the woods continued. Adjusted rounds from the mortars began to hit their mark to the north, but the enemy persisted. So here we have a sense of how much time it takes to adjust mortar fire, organic mortar fires, onto a specific dismounted target. Adjusted rounds from mortars began to hit their mark to the north, but the enemy persisted. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Americans needed more firepower to turn the tide. At this time, Staff Sergeant Monty and Sergeant Hawes turned their attention to the wounded Private First Class Bradbury, who lay approximately 60 feet away in the open. Although partially hidden from enemy observation, Bradbury was still very much in danger of being hit with indirect fire. He could weakly communicate with the others behind the rocks, but his wounds were such that he could do little else. Staff Sergeant Monty quickly decided that he had to retrieve Bradbury and get him safely behind the rocks. He turned control of the squad radio over to Sergeant Christopher Grzecki and prepared to make a rush into the open. His first attempt carried him a few feet away from the rocks before a hail of enemy small arms fire forced him to take cover behind a small rock wall, skirting the edge of the perimeter. Here Monty found himself next to the body of Sergeant Liebert. After waiting another minute, he jumped over the wall and tried again to make his way to Bradbury, only to be forced back again by withering fire. Before making what would be his final attempt to save Bradbury, Staff Sergeant Monty yelled to the other members of the kill team that he needed covering fire from their M203 grenade launcher. So here we have, an in-action use of the M203 grenade launcher, something that in game terms will be a secondary weapon system for some fire teams. Sergeant Hawes fired a number of 203 rounds into the tree line to the north, and the rest of the team opened up with a barrage of supporting rifle fire. At this point, Monty sprinted into the open toward Bradbury, and within seconds was mortally wounded when an RPG round slammed into the ground a few feet from him. Minutes later, just as the sun dropped behind the ridge line, Staff Sergeant Monty died from his wounds. At this point in the battle, the kill team was holding out for darkness and close air support, both which arrived simultaneously. A B-1 bomber circling overhead delivered a number of 500 and 2,000-pound Joint Direct Attack Munitions, or JDAMs, which slammed into the woods on the northern stretch of the ridge line. The bombs shook the ground and covered the team's position in a cloud of dust. Numerous 105mm artillery and mortar rounds also found their mark in the woods, forcing the enemy fire to wither. One Squadron Fire Support Officer, or FSO, remembered, "We used nearly every mortar round they had out there." The kill team emptied their magazines in the direction of the attack, although in the increasing darkness they were relying more on sound than sight to target the enemy. So here we have, one, the idea of going low and black on ammo, and we also have the idea of firing at targets without observation but using sound. Less than 10 minutes later, the enemy fire ceased, and only the sounds of circling aircraft and American voices shouting to one another could be heard. The firefight was over. 2 non-commissioned officers from the team were dead, and another soldier was critically wounded but alive. Later estimates would place the number of enemy killed at 26 and the number of wounded at 17. The entire engagement lasted less than 60 minutes. Aftermath. The fight on Mountain 2610 may have been over, but the members of the kill team would not know it until the next morning. They spent the rest of the night of 21-22 June on 100% security, anticipating another attack. Nervousness and fatigue, combined with the painful grief at the loss of their 2 fellow soldiers, to make the wait for sunrise was a harrowing task. While many of the soldiers would have taken the chance to withdraw from the mountain in the dark, to do so with 2 KIAs and 1 critically wounded soldier presented too much of an obstacle. Immediately after the fight, a medical evacuation aircraft, a UH-60 Blackhawk, from the 159th Medical Company, flew up to the ridgeline to extract the wounded. Tragedy struck the team once more as Bradbury and a medic, Staff Sergeant Heath Craig, were being hoisted up to the helicopter. The litter basket in which they sat began to oscillate, rapidly, causing the winch to pinch the lifting cable against the side of the aircraft. As a result, the cable snapped, sending Bradbury and Craig plummeting hundreds of feet to the ground below. Both were killed. It was another devastating blow to the team as it sought to regroup from the jarring events of that evening. As much as the battle staff of Task Force Titan wanted to get the kill team off the mountain that night, the proposition seemed too risky, particularly after the medevac accident. It is also important to note that just 6 weeks prior, on the night of 25 May 2006, the task force suffered a catastrophic crash of a CH-47 that was extracting soldiers from a small landing zone perched on the ridge above Chalke Valley. 10 soldiers were killed, including the 371 Cav commander, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Fenty. I'll interject very quickly here that I remember, like many others, I remember that night very well, that tragic night. The emotional and psychological toll of the crash still weighed heavily on the squadron. Major Richard Timmons, the squadron S3, stated, "People were very hesitant to place helicopters in dangerous positions after the accident. Captain Burkhoff agreed, remembering that no one wanted to risk another bird." The 371 commander, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Howard, reported the decision to leave the kill team in position until the next day up to the 3rd BCT and CJTF 76. All agreed that attempting a helicopter extraction that night was simply too dangerous. Instead, the task force ensured that they had continuous aerial surveillance and fire support coverage for the team's position for the duration of the night. When morning broke, I should point out here that when I just said, I'll repeat, the 371 commander, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Howard, reported the decision to leave the kill team in position. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Howard replaced Lieutenant Colonel Fenty after the accident and the death of Fenty. Lieutenant Colonel Howard was, if I remember correctly, the first senior leader I met when I reported to 10th Mountain Division immediately before deploying to Afghanistan, just a few months before these events. All right, when morning broke on 22 June, the kill team was more than ready to return to Fob-Nuray. Actually, I should interject that when I met Lieutenant Colonel Howard, part of that meeting, brief meeting, made me think that I would actually be going to 371, that I could be going to 371 Cav, or another battalion that Lieutenant Colonel Howard would be commanding. I don't remember the details of why I thought that, but anyways, events turned out differently. They had fought hard against a determined enemy that outnumbered them and beat them back, but nearly 25% of the team did not make it off the ridge line alive. It was not a definitive defeat, but also not a victory of any kind. The team made a quick descent from the mountain during the day on 22 June and was back at Fob-Nuray before nightfall. Fellow Task Force Titan soldiers met the tired members of the team as they entered the main gates of the FOB and assisted them in removing and securing their equipment. The story of the fight spread through Task Force Titan, and Staff Sergeant Monty's heroism quickly became apparent to all in the command. That day, the task force commander initiated Monty's posthumous promotion to the rank of Sergeant First Class. 2 days later, a patrol from the squadron's Charlie Company returned to the site of the firefight to secure the small amount of tactical gear that the kill team was forced to leave behind. One of the officers on the patrol expressed his amazement at the amount of blood present at the site, uncertain if it was enemy or friendly. He later commented, "If death had a smell, that was it." No enemy remains were discovered at the site. The squadron pushed into the Gremon Valley on 24 June, establishing a presence that they would not relinquish. From September to November of 2006, Task Force Titan manned a combat outpost, a COP, on the ridgeline just east of Mountain 2610 and named it in honor of Sergeant Patrick Liebert. From there, the soldiers of Task Force Titan built relationships with the local population and monitored activity in the valley for the remainder of their deployment. Over 3 years later, Sergeant First Class Monty was awarded the Medal of Honor, the second recipient of the award from the war in Afghanistan. Indeed, the story of Monty's performance under fire dominated the news of the Gowardesh fight in the years following. The events of that night, however, offered a number of insights for U.S. forces fighting in Afghanistan, well beyond the acts of a single individual. When Sergeant Daniel Linehan was asked what advice he would offer to other soldiers based on his experience on Mountain 2610 that night, he stated, simply, complacency kills. The attack had occurred so suddenly that, according to Linehan, it served as a sobering reminder that insurgent ambushes, particularly in the mountains of northeastern Afghanistan, are rarely detectable. I never took my gear off again for the remainder of the deployment, he later claimed. For Staff Sergeant Cunningham, the enduring lesson was simple. More vigilance was needed in dealing with an enemy that was both elusive and bold. This message would prove prophetic 2 years later in a spot that was immediately adjacent to the scene of the Gowardesh firefight. The units that replaced Task Force Titan in the Grumman Valley area continued to man Cop Libert and experienced little to no enemy activity for months at a time. In May of 2008, a Stars and Stripes reporter visiting U.S. soldiers operating near Gowardesh reported, "The chances of a well-coordinated and a successful enemy attack are pretty slim. The biggest enemy they face, at least for the moment, is the boredom." 2 months later, soldiers from the 3rd Brigade Combat Team, 1st Infantry Division, were enjoying what they perceived as a low-threat environment at Cop Libert, with one soldier describing the mission as a normal day-to-day life and others expecting a quiet deployment. On 11 September 2008, insurgents attacked the Cop without warning, and a 2-hour firefight ensued. In the end, support from Apache helicopters and A-10 aircraft was needed to drive off the attackers, leaving one U.S. soldier dead. If nothing else, the firefight of 21 June 2006 demonstrated that U.S. forces could easily underestimate the enemy. The insurgents were more capable and thus more dangerous than U.S. soldiers had anticipated. After his deployment, Captain Burkhoff, Task Force Titan's intelligence officer, made this point emphatically. Quote, "As a whole, we clearly underestimated the enemy's organizational capabilities. This particular engagement taught us that the enemy at Nuristan did not mind fighting us during the night. They were opportunistic fighters. They launched that attack with little prior planning and little thought of their own risks. It was the first time they ever saw American soldiers set up in their own woods' backyards, and they were eager to do some damage." End quote. With this type of aggressive, organized, and motivated adversary operating around them, the lessons of complacency kills and more vigilance offered by the survivors of the engagement seem fitting indeed. It is unclear what role, if any, tactical complacency played in the events surrounding the engagement on Mountain 2610, but what is evident is that the soldiers of the kill team and Task Force Titan emerged from the event much more aware and prepared for the type of threat they faced. The firefight of 21 June 2006 also highlights the critical role played by artillery and close air support in operations in northeast Afghanistan. The soldiers of the Task Force Titan kill team were the first Americans to fight in the Grumman Valley, but the outcome of the engagement was similar to other engagements in Nuristan and Kunar provinces. In the Korengal, Waigal, and Chake valleys, direct engagements with the enemy usually required both artillery and close air support to disrupt an insurgent attack. The extreme terrain usually prevented the basic tactical principles of identifying, closing with, or even pursuing the enemy. Often the exact location of the enemy was impossible to ascertain from the ground. As such, the soldiers of Task Force Titan and those that arrived after 2006 came to rely heavily on friendly aviation assets and aerial surveillance platforms. If they did not arrive already prepared to coordinate fire support missions, the soldiers operating northeastern Afghanistan would have to become adept at directing artillery and close air support. This skill was critical even for soldiers at the squad level. Absolutely. The logistical constraints of operating in northeast Afghanistan were also made painfully apparent as the kill team found it stuck on the ridgeline in need of food and water, forcing the task force to conduct a high-risk resupply operation in daylight. The act of climbing mountains, some in excess of 7,000 feet, brought with it a myriad of limitations in relation to the time, flexibility, and contingency of any operation. In the case of Operation Gowardesh Thrust, when the mission was delayed, the squadron staff believed the only feasible option was to leave the kill team in position, primarily because of the time and effort required to infiltrate the position. After being accustomed to a modern training world where Humvees, trucks, and helicopters facilitated rapid movement on the battlefield, the soldiers of Task Force Titan found the terrain of Kunar and Nuristan to be a stark, tactically debilitating obstacle that slowed logistical operations from squad to division level to a plodding and frustrating pace. This realization came from the hard experience of climbing, step by step. An interview conducted with Task Force Titan soldiers and officers towards the end of their rotation suggested that no one, it seems, told them they would have to fight a Vietnam-style war at high altitudes. In such an environment, the type of food and water shortage experienced by the kill team on 21 June, something rare in the training world, became a more common occurrence throughout Task Force Titan's rotation that year. One squadron officer stated, "We've gone on mission after mission after mission where we've gone black on food and water," adding, "We end up stuck on a mountaintop for 2 weeks. If you can't get us off a mountain, don't put us there." These logistic and operational frustrations defined much of Task Force Titan's year on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and would remain defining factors for the follow-on units as well. Despite the numerous challenges offered by the environment, the soldiers and leaders of Task Force Titan found a way to wage a counterinsurgency in Kunar and Nuristan. The enduring message they offered their successors was that this war was very much a process of trial and error, both tactically and logistically. It is true that the soldiers of Task Force Titan were not totally prepared for the challenges that awaited them in the mountains. This fact is neither surprising nor unexpected, given that it was the first American battalion to operate in the region. The firefight above Gowardesh was one of the first of many poignant examples of American soldiers facing significant adversity in the mountains of northeast Afghanistan and fighting through it. When they were attacked by an enemy with superior numbers and sufficient firepower, the members of the kill team stood their ground on challenging terrain and fought off the attack. They did not withdraw or permit themselves to be overrun. They were able to successfully integrate artillery and close air support into the fight, a critical task in this war. Although a number of tactical decisions could have been made differently, it is impossible to know how different actions would have changed the outcome of the engagement, if at all. The events of that night above Gowardesh have, up to the publication of this study, served as the context for one of the war's few medals of honor. The greater significance of the firefight of 21 June 2006, however, lay in its indication of the campaign to come. The units that followed Task Force Titan into northeast Afghanistan over the 4 years that followed their deployment would continue to face serious difficulties created by the unforgiving terrain, harsh weather, and committed insurgent enemy. Ultimately, the story of Task Force Titan Kill Team on Mountain 2610 is the story of all U.S. soldiers finding a way to wage a complex counterinsurgency in a very challenging operational environment.